Okay. So I think what I like to do in this afternoon section is to both tell you the process for my first book project, which was my dissertation. And then I like to respond to some of the response papers that I've got from the, I think, 9 people who have submitted them. There are some really interesting questions that I think the whole class would benefit from hearing both the questions and my response, and also maybe other people's responses. Some of them are related to the first piece of reading, the chapter comparing, or this morning's readings, about the method, extended case method itself. So I will just combine them, and we'll have a general discussion about all the issues being raised. And also I encourage you to bring to the table other questions that you have based on this morning's lecture. So I assume that many of you who especially those who have signed up for this class, have read that piece, the ASL piece. Now, ASL is, for those who are not in sociology, it is the flagship journal of the American Sociological Association, and usually is considered the most important, most widely read journal in sociology. And I assigned that piece instead of the book, which evolved from my dissertation, both because it's shorter. I know I don't want to overburden you with lots of reading, and also for another very important reason, which is the idea that you can publish ethnography in journals, and even the mainstream journal. So don't exclude yourself from that possibility. And ethnography, a lot of people think is good for book length writing, but not for very, concise and compact journal article form. But I think it's not just me. I may be the very first few people who did it, but in recent years, they're still rare, but it's possible. I have known friends and some, close friends who have used qualitative and ethnographic research as the basis to produce publications that the mainstream will have to read. And of course, getting an article out in the top journal usually helps with the career, the jobs that you get. In recent years, in my department at UCLA, whenever we have junior positions, we interview people, and the shortlisted candidates, almost without exception, has already one or more, it's scary, one or more articles published in ASL or AJS, which is another flagship journal. So, the job market in the US has become crazily competitive. And for top department, we're in the top 10, so top 10 departments just simply expect job candidates, even for the junior positions, have already very high profile publications. If not in these two, then in theory and society, at least one of those, social forces, one of those top places. But I'm not trying to encourage you to be instrumental, but I think one of the advantages, which I really appreciate, and aside from the career consideration, is that people who would never read my work would read my ASL piece. So if you want to reach out to a larger audience in the professional field, I think you just have to put yourself out there in the mainstream journal, and to prove that your work is not on the margin. We who do ethnography, we're not on the margin of the profession. The very best ethnographies can get published also in a mainstream journal. And so think about that, your work, but it does require a certain level of theoretical engagement and clarity of argumentation, which, at least according to, I don't remember who now, I have the names here, according to one of you, in the response paper, he or she said that this is exactly what he or she doesn't like about my ASRPs. It is that it has lost the flavor, the ethos of ethnography, because it's too clear. It misses the fussiness, which I admire. This is a very interesting argument we can talk about, because reading my work in that format, in a journal format, it's very clear cut, 3 anomalies, 2 cases. You control for some variables and you let the other variable speak for the causal relationship that I find. And to this particular person, to this particular reader, what's the point of doing ethnography then? Because everything is so clear. Whereas ethnography, sometimes some of you maybe are attracted to this mode of inquiry exactly because it can capture some of the fuzziness, the murkiness, the contradictions, the thickness. Kierkegaard used to say thick description. The thickness, the open-endedness that make up our experience of society. And by making things so clear, you lose that. And where is the ethos of ethnography then? Anyone want to respond? Since we're talking about it, why don't we? How many of you have the same question? Reading my piece. No? But many of you nodded your head when I was just trying to repeat the question. How would you respond to that comment? It's not just relevant to my piece. If you think about what you have read in sociology, a lot of times it's very clear-cut, the argument. And then we want people to be clear, right? Your professors would push you. Hey, clarify what you're saying. What's your point? What's your theoretical framework? What's this and that? To push you to clarify. Yes?
I would see the fuzziness of ethnography as the process of doing that instead of writing one.
You like the process of doing ethnography?
I mean, the point of fuzziness or the roughness of the phenomenon or the situation that we study or that we are involved in is the process instead of the product, the final product, like the article. So
okay.
I would say I would love to read one that is quicker in terms of the final product, but that's different from the whole experience of doing the stuff.
Okay. Any other response? Yes.
我想要分享一下我自己在写我的论文的时候，也有遇到类似的问题，就是当时口委们也有提出，他觉得我写的东西有点太，就是清楚的有一个类型，就是有个 ideal type，但是有时候就失去了那种血漏，就是他血漏就是他看不到他看不到活生生的人，对，
活生生的人
的经验，或者是说那个人的经验好像已经都被我分类了，然后他会看不到其他的可能性。他说也许也有介于中间的然后或者是他可能还有更多 possibility， 可是他在我的那个 ideal type 里面他看不到。
所以就是说so you're saying that to your reader, once you analyze, once you categorize, it has the problem of being too clear-cut in terms of categorizing phenomenon into boxes. Is that what?
Yeah. 然后相对于就是因为我大学的时候上过民族志的课程，然后当然就有 assign 一些是人类学家做的民族志，那读起来的感觉就真的非常不一样。因为人类学的民族志就会比较强调 thickness， 他什么都把它记下来，他说的非常 detail。可是对于社会学训练背景的人来说，就会说 所以我看了这些，你到底想要表达什么 concept 给我？对，然后所以有时候在作为一个研究者，或是正在学习怎么做研究的人，或做民主制的人，就会觉得哦，那我要怎么取舍？就是很难 balance。
有人碰过这个问题吗？ Anyone experience similar kind of struggle balancing both the thickness of ethnography and the clarity, analytical clarity of sociology? Yes.
就是我论文写完之后，我有在做一些公共书写的改写。然后对我来讲，刚刚那个问题一部分是受众，是 audience 怎么看待这件你要表达的东西。对啊，那所以在写论文的时候，我会必须要去构想说我的分析怎么样跟既有理论去对话。但我在做一些公共书写的时候，我要想的是我这东西的 implication 是什么，我要怎么样指向可能是政策的，可能是更就是制度面的一些讨论等等，那跟现实中的一些政策怎么样去对话？那我在书写上就必须要重新去做调整。所以我觉得那个 fuzziness 或是那个就是 clarify 的过程里面，怎么样去写本身，它跟你设想你的受众是谁的关系很大。对。
这个this of course is an issue, the target audience. Who are you writing for? And you can use the same research material to write multiple versions of the same research, but talking to different people. As he said, policy implication, you write to policy people, then you have a particular kind of narrative narrative strategy that you would use to speak to that audience. If you're writing to a professional audience, that would be different. But let's confine ourselves to academic audiences. We still have multiple disciplinary audiences. And so you can see who you're writing for and adjust accordingly. But let's take another step and back to the original question of why do we want to be so clear in the first place for sociologists? Why do we strive for clarity? Now, what does clarity mean? It usually means we simplify. And I think this is the real complaint by anthropologists, that you simplify. Where is the detail? Where are the stories? Where are the emotions? The little details. And some of the responses to my piece actually said, hey, you look at these women workers in the workplace. What about these women workers' behavior in a non-work situation? Now, this is something that, I don't know, she doesn't have to be an anthropologist, he or she doesn't have to be an anthropologist. But this is the question that people, when you say you're doing ethnography, they expect you to tell them a lot of stories, a lot of people, characters, a lot of relationships. And it's like storytelling, fiction writing. That's what they expect. And that's why when you don't deliver enough of those blood and flesh kind of infused characters and people, there's no stories or not enough of them, then they question you. Are you doing ethnography? So let's go back to the question. Then, well, yes, we are ethnographers, but we're also sociologists. Why is that the case that sociologists have a tendency to simplify? What's good about simplifying? Yes.
I think to the academic audience, it is better for us to have a clear platform. If we have a clear argument, and it will also be a better platform for us to debate or to discuss. And I can understand the significance you want to suggest in your article, and I can have my feedback clearly.
Right, so for debate, but then anthropologists also want debate. Why do they want some clarity? Are there anthropologists in the room? There must be. Can you defend your discipline? Can you explain to us why are you so obsessed with thick description?
Yeah, I should admit first that I wrote a piece, but
Oh, you're the one who said
yeah.
that I'm too clear.
我想对我来说，就是我们都知道这个现实是这么的复杂，所以我想问题就是回到老师说，那 就是简化所带来的 implications 到底是什么？就是这也是我很好奇的，因为就是请大家容忍我对社会学的无知，就是我是很缺乏这方面相关的东西。只是说，既然做田野的人都明确的知道这个世界是这么的复杂，这么多层次，那我们到底要怎么样去处理这些东西？那这也是我觉得 Broadway 的那个文章比较没有写到部分，就是那个 representation 的部分。就是说，当我们强调田野的过程，那中间它跟你最后写出来的那个文体之间的那个距离，到底要怎么样去填补它？我们到底要怎么相信，就是这个在线的东西是 a part of reality？ 就是这是我作為一個門外漢的困惑，這樣子。謝謝。
什麼是 part of reality？
就是the gap between your crude data and the piece you've written. I think there's a gap in between.
Of course, one is reality, one is a text.
But 但我觉得就是在波威这个文章，因为他没有去处理那个 writing 的部分。It's kind of similar to the 1980s writing culture people, a similar critics. Like how to 就是
Okay.
If we view ethnography as participant observation or fieldwork, then how about the writing part, the writing part on your desk? And how do you trim those muddy actualities into chops?
So writing is a simplification of reality, right? You select, you write, you have to select out of the multitude of phenomena and people in the reality. You select and write. And so it involves a selection process. It involves a simplification process. So that is a basic problem, or if it's a problem, it is a basic feature of all academic or scholarship or research work, because by the fact that you're doing research, you're not living in that reality. You are keeping a distance from it, right? In order to study it. Because most people live their life, they don't stop and think about or trying to make sense or theorize what is my experience like? How does it compare to other people's experience? Most people live in the practical, what Bourdieu would call a logical practice. They just live their world and try to make possible survival and living with others. They play by the rules so that they can practice normal social interaction. But for us, we take ourselves consciously. The scholastic mode, again, is what Bourdieu has said, is different from the practical mode, because we are not just living there. By doing participant observation, actually we put ourselves in the practical mode at one moment, but then take ourselves out at another, so that we can do participation and observation. So the term participant observation involves two mental processes. One, you participate, you lose yourself. You place yourself, you forget you're a PhD student, you go in to work along full-time workers. But at another moment, as observer, you become your scholar again and try to make sense of what you have found during the moments of participation. So it's a dialectic between an insider and an outsider. And it is absolutely critical that you understand the research process requires you to do both. You participate and come out. So when you participate, you have access to that complexity, but when you come out, when you do the analysis, your job at that moment as the observer, as the analyst, is not to retain that complexity, but to explain what is going on. And once you have to explain, and this is key, why do we simplify? What is theory? Basically, theory is a simplification of reality, and you can't explain without simplification. You want to get at the key thing that underlies the surface, the essential. This is Marx's appearance and essence. The appearance is on the surface, but what goes beneath it is what produces the surface appearances. And so it is an assumption that our job is to find those mechanisms that produce the surface appearances of richness and complexity and chaos and all the details that we experience in real life. The social science job, social scientist's job, is not to ignore, but through the surface appearances, observable appearances, which are our only directly accessible data. Observe those, but try to discover the underlying mechanisms, processes that produce those surface complexity. And if you stay loyal to that complexity, you're not explaining. You're not reducing, because we assume that something more fundamental, simplifying some processes, are producing those multitude of appearances. And by simplifying, you're getting at the underlying mechanisms. And I think that's why sociology is compared to anthropology, I think the basic disciplinary standpoint, perspective, it has some differences and of course overlaps. But in sociology, there is more of an emphasis to explain things, whatever that means. Whereas in anthropology, the best that would come close to that is to understand. So it's a very hermeneutic, interpretive kind of job. So one village is fine, one factory is fine, as long as you do a good job of deciphering, I'm thinking of some webs of meaning, you sort of disentangle those webs of meaning and make clear why people, how do they see each other, that makes possible a cultural community or social interaction, for instance. So it's more interpretive than scientific, it's more hermeneutic than explanatory. And the goal, I think, and also the attraction to me about ethnographic sociology is we try, not always perfectly or successfully, but try to bring these two moments together and avoid that stark choice of only interpreting human action or only mapping their structural relation, which is the job of statistics, correlation. What is correlating with what? And be able to really try to, through humans' action and agency, combined with analysis of history and structure, to try to explain why people behave in a certain way. So the interpretive moment is critical, because otherwise we won't understand social action. But only that moment is not enough, because any ordinary social actor, even trained sociologists as a social actor, we can't always be fully conscious of all the structural and historical elements that shape our behavior. So if you only understand my meaning and my understanding, my interpretation of the world, you are going to miss something that is outside my interpretive framework. Because, I may not be aware, there may be subconscious level realities and historical factors that I live in this world and I don't know it is acting on me. It requires a lot of research to identify those factors, and that is exactly where the sociology role comes in, and to reestablish that kind of explanatory scientific moment. And so this is the questions you raise are terrific, and I think is commonly found among anthropologists when they read our work. But I think we need to be clear about why we want to reduce. There's a level reduction of complexity, and if you want to explain things, that is necessary, because otherwise everything will be relevant. Then you're merely describing, registering, empirically reproducing in text form the outside reality, which you always fail to do, because what? How do you describe this room? You'll never be able to exhaust. Are you going to describe the particles in the air? You can't be, because there's too many things that you can describe. And if the goal is to describe as exhaustive and as thick as possible, then what is the use of that description? Because how to use it? We live here, so why do we need another description? And if these things would change because the air particle would go in and come, this has become a unique, time-based, place-based, unique phenomenon. So why do we care about this? Why do we want to, register it in any form? So long answer to response to you. I hope you can appreciate the necessary reduction of complexity, and that sometimes you simplify because you want to get at the underlying mechanism and factors. Now, you can always debate whether one analysis or another get it correctly, get the mechanism correctly. That's another debate, right? But the goal is, and whether you agree with the analysis is another issue, but the goal of simplifying, conceptualizing, categorizing is to find order out of chaos. Even in conflict situation, which is very chaotic, you want to be able to reduce conflict process into elements so that you can analyze their relationship in under different conditions. So this is not a defense of my piece. And indeed, when I look back, I would say more later, that when I look back at that piece now, I think I committed a very terrible mistake of pursuing a kind of comparison that is particularly bad at particularly vulnerable to one mode of thinking, which is the variable mode of thinking. I disaggregate. I have two cases. Okay, stepping back for those of you who may not know what I was doing in this research. How did I start this research? I should start. Now we're going into this particular research. Okay, so after I finished my qualifying exams, you're supposed to, like PhD students in this room, you are supposed to do what I said this morning. You have to come up with a research puzzle, a research question, a project for your dissertation. And my advice this morning, if you remember, is that you find something, what did I say?
Anomaly.
Sorry?
Anomaly.
Anomaly, yes. You find something that is puzzling because it's an anomaly. Anomaly means puzzles vis-a-vis some kind of some bodies of existing knowledge. That's one criteria. Another is what? There are some other things too. What are the important things to consider when you choose?
Figure out the structure, then have the external force influencing.
Well, that's the goal of research. But when you decide on a topic, I'm trying to explain to you how I hit on this topic. Why do I want to study women workers in China?
Existing knowledge cannot explain this. Existing knowledge cannot explain or describe it.
Right, yes. Well, that's the theoretical part of constituting a puzzle. But I'm going to tell you, instead of you guessing what I'm getting at, I had to consider significance. Remember, I said find a topic that carries a significance so that whatever you find, people will be interested to read because it's significant. Now, why is women workers significant besides the point that in the literature at that point, the Marxist literature really has ignored gender because it's class first, right? They look at class, gender, ethnicity are considered derivative of class positions and class structure. So that's one significance, a theoretical significance, scholarly significance. But I think there is another thing that really drew me to this question of workers. Well, of course, personally, because my advisor worked in that field, so it's very easy for me to be influenced by him, and he's a big figure in that field. So I've always been, interested. I was inspired by his work. But that's the scholarly origin. When you choose a topic, I didn't consciously do it at that point, but what I was thinking when I was trying to pick a topic, I could pick a historical topic, I don't have to do the contemporary. The reason why I think it's important is at that point, 1991, 2 years after Tiananmen crackdown, the Chinese economy was really tanking, and mainland China, Beijing was nervous. And legitimacy-wise, it also was, hit a setback. So it was launching this open door, really radical liberalization of the economy to try to regain both the growth of the economy. There were sanctions against Beijing at that point because of the crackdown. And also, Beijing was trying to re-legitimize itself by growing the economy, open up. So that was the point when China actually had, Beijing had the goal of transforming China into the workshop of the world. Now, okay, if China was going to be a workshop of the world, what will be the most important factor, condition for it to become the workshop of the world? Workers. You can't be the workshop of the world if you don't have enough workers. And of course, China had enough workers. So the question is not whether it has a supply of labor. The question is whether it has supply to very controllable, docile workers. So control of workers becomes this very important topic and issue for China's development at that moment, as it aspired to become an export powerhouse. Whether workers would resist or not is the issue. If worker was going to have widespread reaction and resistance, and if unions were strong, there's no way China would become this workshop of the world because wages would be so much higher and industrial peace was not guaranteed, and why would all these investors flood it to China? So guaranteeing worker supply, and not just worker supply, but also cheap and docile labor, is a theoretical question, but also a question that people who don't care about sociology would want to know. If you're an investor, you need to know. If you are a movement, international global unionist, you want to know, because this is the largest national labor force. Whatever happens to it, whatever it is, whatever I find out, will be very important, particularly at that moment of China's industrialization, export-led industrialization. So I think my consideration was it has to be it has to be important. I was really curious about it because of my thinking. And I think looking back, it was a good choice of topic, theoretically, politically, policy-wise, journalistically. I mean, you can write anything and people will still want to publish it. This is something that I hope you'll find. I don't know what is the issue in Taiwan today that has that kind of significance. It's societal, it's sociological, it is in so many ways. I mean, I challenge you to say to me, find one reason why studying workers in China is not important. It'll be difficult because it is, whether you're a Marxist or not, right? I mean, it doesn't have to be a Marxist to want to understand what is happening to the labor force that makes possible the workshop of the world. Even my students, undergrad students, want to know about the working condition because they use the products of that labor all the time. So when you think about the advice, the lesson to you is, of course, find something that is of interest to you, find something that is a puzzle vis-a-vis the literature, but also, as much as possible, try to find something that would have or guarantee you a wide readership, and people would want to read. A lot of times we write things that nobody except a few colleagues would read. That's fine, because not everybody is a scholar. But if you want to, particularly for some of you and young people in particular, you want to change the world. I know some of you reading your responses. I know some of you belong to that category. And then you want to pick a topic that has relevance, really. And there are many. So for instance, I give you another ongoing example. My new work, I've just started a new project on China's platform capitalism. Not many people know the word. Platform capitalism or economy is one driven by algorithm, big data, internet platforms. So it's a new type of capital. And so one of the cases is e-commerce. Alibaba, most of you have heard the Taobao village, those village that produces those goods that you find online. So last night, 2 days ago, before I came here, I was at a conference, and they said there are now like 10,000 Taobao villages in China. Well, okay, So how am I going to pick my case? How they cover so many different kinds of industries. So again, I was trying to think, what would appeal to most people that they would care once I write about a particular Taobao village that produces that kind of commodities. If you write about what would you care? What would you not care? Sometimes if they produce things like you know, nails or some machine tools, you wouldn't be interested because you're not a worker. You have never worked with a machine. You don't care about how a machine tool is being made. And I'm narrowing it down. I'm thinking about two things. Jeans. Do you know the world's largest, like 60% of the world's jeans is produced in some part of Guangdong. It's called Xintang. And there are a number of Taobao villages there. So that's a good case to choose, I think, because jeans is a very typical kind of garment. Everybody. Now, I promised I talk about, I didn't talk about access and power. Maybe this is a good time to go to that issue. Access is different for every single study. You can't do a ethnographic study without access, but access can be built. As I told you this morning, I didn't have access to those powerful companies in Zambia, but once once a friend becomes vice president, things changed. So patience pays off. That's my experience as well. I know students have very limited time to wait for things to happen. So strategically, you should try to find something that gives you access rather than being very idealistic and ambitious and think about a project that you have really no time to build your contact and risk failure. But once become more secure in your job, I think the general principle is persistence, perseverance usually pay off, and don't give up so easily. Although it's easy to think about giving up. I don't know how many times I've thought about giving up when I was in Africa because I wasn't going anywhere with my fieldwork before these companies opened up to me. I was doing small things, interviewing miners, but not really as an ethnographer. As I said, I can't rely on in-depth interviews alone. So I've thought about giving up many times, but each time what kept me going was the intrinsic curiosity that got me started in the project, and my ambition to try to use ethnography to tackle a global phenomenon. And I want to see how far this method could go. So that's access. The entry, write intensive field notes when you enter, because that usually gives you a good sense of the power landscape that you have to navigate during the entire process of research. I think I'll try to say more when I come to the third book. Studying up and down. Now this is something to note. We usually study down. Sociologists usually, anthropologists for that matter, usually study down in a sense of we study people who are below us in the social structure. The unfortunate, I think it's unfortunate, consequence is that sociology, if you look at the entirety of sociology as a field of knowledge, we know about the powerless social groups much more than we know about the elite. There's an extreme imbalance in the focus of sociology, what we know, and whether knowing more about the powerless people is conducive to reproducing their powerlessness. This is something that I've found very ironic, and I don't know how to overcome it. Because when you come to think about it, I study work, okay? And you try to expose everything about workers, how they live, what they think, how they resist, how they try to go to the bathroom longer than they need to. as a form of resistance. So labor historians, there's lots of story about bathroom breaks, which still today everywhere is still a class, one of the most contentious class issues in the shop floor. How long you can take your bathroom break. So we know a lot about working class culture, how they borrow money from each other, the domestic violence, how they raise children, everything. The sex life, the culture, their writings, their poetry. Are we reproducing their subordination? By revealing so much about every single detail of their collective life. Some people would say, hey, you don't, and actually it's not just some of you, one of you who wrote the responses here, but other people have said that, have said about me, that I didn't say enough about resistance. Well, first of all, I wrote a whole book on labor protests in the Rust Belt and Sun Belt. I don't know how that critique is valid. But anyway, a very common critique of me, especially the first book, is that, hey, you don't write about resistance. Okay, but I've devoted a whole book to it. What is in another book, not in the same book. So it's wrong that I don't pay attention to resistance. But the undertone of that kind of criticism is, until we write about resistance of the powerless people, you are not for them, you're not supportive of them, you're not contributing to social change with them as the central agency. I challenge that view. As a matter of fact, the more we write about them, and only about them, and not about the oppressor class, the powerful people, I think the more you are protecting the unequal power structure rather than helping the cause of the revolution. Because knowledge is power, you are giving the elite so much more ammunition by producing sociology that on the outside, look, you are for the underdog. But the objective consequence of that class imbalance of studying down instead of up is you give a lot of knowledge, you're exposing a lot of the underclass for the manipulation of the state, capital, or whoever it is who have power. So think twice when you complain to that, this guy, this scholar, he or she doesn't talk about resistance. So what? You talk about resistance. Does it change anything? I mean, it's very naive to say that when you see a writer promoting, the working class in China is revolutionary, as if that is going to that is going to make the working class revolutionary. Whereas I'm exposing why the working class is not revolutionary because of the state and capital. I have become the person of preserving the status quo. Whereas actually my work is to point to the structure of oppression. Even if I don't always, not in every single piece of my writing, emphasize revolution is imminent in China, which, by the way, is not true. How on earth can China become the workshop of the world if the working class is thinking about revolution every single day? It's simply untrue. But there are people who care about workers. They come with certain value judgment and some expectation of what scholarship can do for the working class movement. And sometimes they confuse these agendas. And sometimes they think scholarship should be just talking about revolution or social change. Yes, you can talk about social change, but how can you change society if you don't understand what makes society the status quo? What is the status quo? How does it work for you to change what? So don't get into that kind of easy, simplistic, ideologically driven sectarianism, which I'm very sad to see happening in the field of China studies and China labor studies. Anyway, so where was I? Okay, so the book, basically, the book was not about everything about Chinese workers or women. The book has a very clear agenda, and it's not about resistance. It is about how Chinese women workers are being controlled. What are the factory regimes? How did the factory regimes that control them make them docile and compliant? How does it work? How does that regime work? What constitutes those regime, the regime? So from the beginning, it is talking, the goal for me was to examine how power works, not how people resist that power. You can't expect a book to explain everything. So the fact that if my book has ignored or played down resistance, which actually I had some everyday resistance even in the article, it doesn't mean that I ignore the existence of resistance. It just means that my book has a clear agenda. I want to focus on how power works on these women. That's the first thing. The second thing is, why didn't I, going to do the field work, I spent a lot of time with these workers. Why didn't I see resistance? Why didn't I focus on resistance? Because a very simple answer to you is that there wasn't much resistance, not just in that factory, but in those days. Remember, we were talking about in that research, the first generation, the very, very first batch of migrant workers from the countryside who really wanted to leave the village and enter factories. And you know what? And that was to my surprise, when I worked alongside these young women workers from the countryside, they actually enjoyed working 15 hours, 14 hours a day in a very structured way, according to a very structured timetable, and in very cramped dormitories. I was the one complaining. They were not. Do you know why? And that is why you need to do the research, the ethnographic research, because they explained to me, I said, well, you're not tired. This is like stuffy and tiring, and you didn't go anywhere. You were stuck to your seats for those hours. Why were you guys happy and enjoying yourself? They said, first, inside a factory, that means they don't have to be exposed to the sun. And being away from the sun for women, young women from the countryside, is already a big break from the kind of physical labor that they were exposed to in the countryside. Now, that's one thing. The other thing is they think that having a clear-cut schedule, timetable every day. You wake up, you go to work, 8 o'clock breakfast, 8:15 you start work, 11:30 you have lunch, and then you get off at a particular fixed time in the day. For them, this is so much more preferable to a structureless timetable in the countryside, where they feel themselves idle, has nothing to do, and need to kill time. Third, they see the factory as a modern institution. They feel they participate in modernity by becoming a factory worker. Now, how could I even imagine these meanings that they attach to factory work unless I experience the hardship from my perspective, but they do not, and be able to really appreciate their experience at that level. And so for people to just say, hey, I didn't talk about resistance, there wasn't that much to talk about unless I really changed the focus because of my political persuasion, because of my willingness or preference, my desire to see people resist and not be truthful to what I see and be truthful to the workers' own experience. And so in those days, the first generation workers, they indeed are much more tolerant because their comparative, the standard they compare factory life with is very different from, for instance, the current generation. And also consumption. There are many reasons why they love factory work and would not think about resisting. After work, very tiring, but they'd still get a day off. They have their own money to spend. And that, to us, of course, you have your own money to spend. We don't even doubt it for a moment. But for these countryside, women from the countryside, there was no cash in those days. Back in the village, it was in the when they were growing up. In the 80s, was still, you need coupons to get noodles and whatnot. So cash was very empowering. So yes, exploitation from observers' point of view, empowerment from the point of view of the subjects. And you need to bring them together to see, and participant observation allows you that the twin finding, the dialectical, contradictory experience. And when you are contradictory in your experience about industrial work, about industrial employment, your will to resist is not so easy, especially given all the constraint and the power, and you are just a teenager, first time in the city. So think about that. It's not a conservative decision. It's not of a politically conservative decision. It is, first of all, because my project really wants to examine how domination works, the system of domination, how it works. And also, the fieldwork suggests that this is what was happening, that resistance, if happened at all, happened at a very microscopic, everyday level that did not amount to systemic changes or challenges. Things would change, and that's why in my second book, I have to pick up the topic of protest, because protest was, after 10 years of accumulation and working class subordination, people began to become unhappy with the system. They became more equipped with collective capacity, and protest and resistance became the dominant thing that people were worried about, government was worried about. So the subject had changed according to reality. So that was the point about the project the book, and for your project also, when people challenge you, hey, you didn't include this and that phenomenon, A and B, you only focus on C. Well, there's a point. You need to focus on something. You can't include everything in the world under the sun into a project. So you have to respond to them. But I think you have to state clearly, if you don't capture all these, related phenomena, it's not your fault. If they are not really central to your research question. You have your research question that you want. If I want to understand power and domination, how it works, then most of my energy and data should be addressed to how power works. There will be another occasion, another project to study protest, how protest works and what are the limits of protest, right? It doesn't mean you ignore them, but you have your focus. Otherwise, your study becomes so unwieldy. There's no end to any, you can't graduate, I'm sorry. And you won't be able to find a job. And you can't find a job, you can't be a scholar, you can't do another study, you can't continue. So please, try to bring something, to bring closure, try to delimit something that you stick with. And there's only so many questions you can answer in one project. Now, protection of research, protection of subjects. Ethics of reciprocity. There are many ethical positions that people want to take when it comes to ethnographic research. But again, in this class, we talk about the minimum. What is the minimum ethical commitment? As an ethnographer, you need to worry about and really worry about. It is the protection of human subjects. And usually that means practically, what do you do then? Oh, protection of human subjects is so vague. What you do, at least, and that is what the IRB, the Institutional Review Board, tries to guarantee the existence of, is informed consent. You tell the people that you study, you hang out with in your field work, inform them about what the research is about, what you are doing, who you are. And they agree to your presence. Is that a new concept to you? Have you heard of this? Have you? Okay. So, well, it sounds straightforward, of course, but in the field, if you have done any field work, you realize this is not as simple as you think, because the field is populated by all kinds of people with in different power positions. So I'll give you an example, not from my research, but from a very classic piece of writing that argues that we, ethnographers, should uphold informed consent as an ethical principle, but how to realize this ethical principle, you should be the one to make the call, how to realize it. So for instance, the example was in that piece, about discrimination, racial discrimination in the housing market, which is a very, persisting, long-standing problem in the US. Black people, colored people, ethnic minorities usually do not get inside the housing market. So because, landlords just imagine these guys are poorer, even if they're employed, they have higher likelihood of being unemployed at some point. But it's illegal to discriminate based on ethnicity. So there's widespread discrimination when people try to apply to rent, for housing, rental housing. So ethnographers want to document this discrimination because this is unjust, and you want to expose discrimination. Now, how do you study discrimination? If you tell the people, the subjects that you are studying, I'm studying your discrimination, would they discriminate in your face when you're there? Not likely. They would be on guard. They would try to change their behavior. Now, the idea then is you are protecting the people who are being discriminated against by studying discrimination, by exposing discrimination, and because of that, you need to protect your subject, the people who are being discriminated against. You have to not give informed consent to some of the people in the field because there are people who need your protection more. Does that make sense to you? Do you understand what I'm trying to explain to you? You're appealing to the same principle, informed consent, informed consent. You're appealing to the important ethical principle, protecting your human subjects. But you make some judgment as to how to do it. Sometimes protecting the subjects that need the most protection means that you have to defy or selectively apply this principle of informed consent, this technique of informed consent. So in my case, not in this particular study, but in my Africa study, I can explain in the last section here how I decided to go against this informed consent and had to do something, without their consent. But in this case, in this factory study, you can still criticize me for not securing informed consent in the purest sense from the workers because they didn't have the opportunity to give me consent in the true sense of the word. Although I made my status very clear, everybody knew if they care to know, and people talk, they knew that I was just a student. Of course, I was young, a little bit older than they are, but not much older at that point when I was writing my dissertation. So I blended in very easily. So people were not aware, and I was, my gender helped because most of the workers were female workers. So protection of human. Okay, so this is about protection of human subjects. So the managers, after letting me in, the big boss didn't care what I was doing, but the managers did, and they make a deal. They wanted me to do something that would potentially hurt the workers. Now, if you were the managers, what would you want me to do? Having me in your factory, you're in a controlling position. You decide where I can go and how much time I spend in the factory. What would you do in your position?
I read your methodology part of that book. You mentioned about the factory, right? They ask you to write for secret report to the management about what the worker is doing, like
right.
Monthly based.
Yes. Thank you for reading the book and remembering this. It's a common thing that you yourself would encounter. If you do an ethnography and there is a clear power structure and you are let in by the powerful people, they usually want something in return. Now, reciprocity, well, you want to be reciprocal. And so you cannot just say no. What would you do? Because if I wrote reports about what I observed, I would become a spy. Because in a class-divided society, of course, in a factory is where the most typical class division happens in manager and workers. That was what Marx was concerned about, right? But then you want to reciprocate. I said, ethics of reciprocity, that includes the managers. And they are in position of power. What would you do? Any suggestion? No? What I did was, of course, I explained at first. My first step was I told him how bad an idea that was, because workers would not accept me if they knew there would be a report about them from me, and that was not a good answer for my managers. They insisted that I write them a report. And then I said, at the beginning they said weekly report. And I said, no, I was too busy to do a weekly report. And so we settled on monthly report. And so you negotiate, okay, you have to negotiate. Sometimes they back off. Sometimes maybe not. In my case, they didn't. So I said, okay, monthly report. I knew I couldn't reject that request. I knew I have a commitment to reciprocate. You want entry, you have to show that you are useful to them. The same with workers, but they have other things. Workers want me to buy things for them from Hong Kong and do this and that, or help them or help their brothers and sisters something. They're always reciprocity in a very material sense. For the managers, I indeed had to write. I submitted a report, but I wrote down things that are not consequential. I just wrote them a report. You can write, there's so many things you can write about that doesn't really constitute any betrayal to the workers, right? You don't have to say, hey, this guy is lazy, that one is hardworking. They go to the bathroom for 10 minutes longer than they're supposed to. You don't have to write these things, which of course are very important elements in my own field notes. So a compromise, negotiate. You can always try to do something to pacify and fulfill their request, but I think there comes a point in time when the researcher is the one who needs protection. And doing research in mainland China, I don't know how many of you will be doing research in mainland China or other authoritarian context, but I think because research method is usually taught in the US, where it's not a concern. I mean, the power relation is different, that you have the constitutional right to do a lot of things which in other places just don't exist. So the emphasis in textbook of ethnographic research always emphasize protection of human subjects and not the protection of the researcher. Actually, what I have found is that, researchers are very vulnerable in many situations. But even in this case, the managers, after several months, they got tired of me poking around, and they begin to worry that because during those months they received letters complaining about canteen food, the food in the mass hall was not good enough, and workers were very unhappy. There was some agitation. They received letters, and that already was assigned to the managers that maybe they tried to find some reason, and of course my presence became a very easy scapegoat or something that they suspect. And so they kicked me out, and I had no way to find myself back to the same factory. But I wanted to flag that, if you don't negotiate, if you don't comply with the power holder in your field site, you may not have that amount of time to spend. So the advisable strategy is to try to comply, at least entertain their request. Again, with workers, I can't literally, smuggle things in from Hong Kong to fulfill my fellow workers' request all the time. But sometimes I would try to do them to show some nice gestures, not necessarily when I was in Africa. I was told by my local friends to take some car parts from the US because there was a lack of everything. And car parts, even windshield, the big, the big window for the cars or the lights. I said, no, I can't do that. But there's always this different kinds of requests that would come your way, and obviously you can't fulfill all of them. But to say no to all is not advisable. So what time is it now? 3:30. I want to address some of these. So basically, I went to these factories, and if you read the article, you know the 3 anomalies. I basically followed very strictly the advice of my advisor. Find the anomalies, define them, and use his theory. Now, I was lucky because I was basically reading his theory of factory regime against feminist literature and combine them both to find some gaps and use those to organize my data. Now, the reaction to the fact that I was too clear, missing the complexity, the processes, the richness of real life. Because the reason for that is not just because I have to simplify and reduce to try to show, to find to understand the underlying factor that had to do with the labor market, and gender construction of the labor market, but also because you can't put everything in. Not all your field notes will end up in your writing. This is something that you have to understand, and because you don't enter everything, because otherwise your publication will be just your field notes. You don't you publish your field notes and that's it. That's rich enough. There's a lot of complexity and fussiness there. But would you read such a kind of book? You don't want to read because there's no way of understanding what does that mean. What is this? And so it's necessary reduction, but also because you have theories that talks about different factors that explain things. And what we do in sociology is we use those structure of the theory, the analytical structure of the theory, as like a hanger. Actually, what I did was when I was writing field notes, yes, I write field notes, but I try to group my field notes according to the concept, emerging concept, or the concept that comes from the theory, so that I wouldn't get lost, so that I would still see myself, okay, I wake up in the morning, I know today what I want to find out with regard to my study. Of course, partly is determined, what I want to find out today is determined by the flow of events of that day, which I have no control over. But as ethnographer, you need to have some sort of agenda in your head as to, should I check out the guys section? There's a whole bunch of, the repair workers were all men. In my book, I wrote about them, not in the article. It's because gender, as I said, a small group of men, but gender, I was looking at gender, how could I not study them? So I would go there and see how different it was and how gender masculinity was constructed. I wasn't very successful because, I wasn't really accepted into that circle. I didn't hang out with them after work. That's another shortcoming of my research. But basically, there are lots of things that got omitted in the final writing of the book, as well as the article. The article is even more demanding in terms of shortening your presentation of the data, reduction of data. It's like the sauce. If you cook your red wine sauce, you cook and cook and cook, and in the end you only have very little, but very tasty. No? That's how you should think about your data. You reduce your data, but leave the best and the richest and the most data and theory relevant. So it's a reduction process, but hopefully you're getting rid of the things that are not essential. So I constructed the argument, the two regimes talk about concept formation. I use a lot of Bourgeois concept, especially despotism and hegemony, but I create or I reformulate his his concepts by adding different adjectives to it, because those adjectives depict the mechanism, the processes I was observing. This is a strategy that you could apply. If you have, it's like Gunnar, he retains the notion of bureaucracy, but qualify the different types of bureaucracy: marked bureaucracy, representative bureaucracy, punishment-oriented bureaucracy. And so this is a way of use good concepts, reformulate the concept according to the data that you found, that you have collected. And along the way, I also reformulated his argument. Now, I didn't want to go into the detail of that piece because you already read, and it's not about, this talk is not about industrial sociology. So even with that research, even though I used his theory as the main structure, I also consulted feminist literature, feminist theory. So it's not like you commit to one theory and that's it. And most of the time, you need to integrate quite a few to come to the structure that would provide the framework for your study. So feel free to bring together different kinds of theory. In my latest book in Africa, China in Africa, I looked at the two different types of capital, and I use Marx, I use Weber, I use Polanyi to put together a kind of analytical framework that we'll talk about in the last session. Yeah, we should take a break, and then I'll come to the questions that you raise and any other question that you may have. So how about 10 minutes again? So we resume 3:40. Okay, let's continue. I realized I haven't discussed what I meant when this morning I said this is a kind of comparison that we call variable comparison, and I realized that there are some significant drawbacks to this method, to this mode of comparison. So actually the topic of this afternoon should be about variable comparison. I totally forgot. So what is variable comparison? Variable comparison means that in each of the two cases, the case in each of these two, if you look inside the case, each of the cases, you realize that my treatment of each case is basically I break down each case into variables. So for instance, when I write about localistic despotism, the case, this factory regime in Shenzhen, the way I analyzed it was that this is a case, and it's separate from the Hong Kong factory, which is a different factory regime I called familial hegemony. So these two cases, first of all, they are separate, right? One case is independent of another case. That's one thing, which I'll come back to. And this may not be the only option. I missed the interconnection between these two cases. So one thing that I assume, or I treated them as independent of each other. The second feature of variable analysis in these two cases is that within each case, I break down one case, one factory regime, into different analytical components. So in each case, I look at the state, whether the state intervenes into the shop floor, because this is in the theory, original theory, a very important part of deciding whether a factory regime is despotic or hegemonic, is whether the state has policies or labor laws or social insurance that regulate what capital can do to workers. So if there are insurance protection, if there are labor laws, that means managers, owners of capital cannot force workers to work beyond a certain number of hours. There's certain protection that would be offered by the state to the factory and limit the power of capital. That means capital needs to create some sort of basis of consent for the workers. They need to treat workers better because the state is protecting workers. If there is unemployment law, that means that workers can risk unemployment because the state would then jump in and provide certain support. And that means capital cannot compel workers to work beyond certain limit. So the state plays a big part in the theory. And the way I treat the state in these two cases is to look at, this state, the Shenzhen, the Chinese government in Shenzhen, and then the British government or Hong Kong government in the Hong Kong case. So I look at the state, and then another element, another variable in these two cases is the labor market. I look at how workers become available, the supply of labor how come women became available, what kind of conditions would allow these women, these two different groups of women, to show up in the labor market and work. And then I look at, what else did I look at? I look at technology. I said, they're the same, but it's in my consideration because another thing that is very important to labor theorists to explain relationship in the labor process is, technology. If you have robot, then that's very different from a very labor-intensive kind of labor process. So I looked at another variable is technology, right? Technology. Another variable is how gender is constructed. What are the notions of gender? Appropriate female behavior in these two cases. I look at, what else? Union power, whether there's any collective capacity. And in my analysis, I said, okay, well, the state, these are two different states. In these two cases, for different reasons, neither of the states in these two cases interferes they don't intervene at all in the shop floor. In the case of Hong Kong, it is because of non-interventionism, very loose British system. There's for a long, long time. It's only until recently that we have minimum wage, a law. There has been no law limiting the number of hours of work in Hong Kong. So it's very backward. It's almost non-interventionism. So when I say in Hong Kong, well, the state doesn't matter because it's not intervening. It doesn't determine because it doesn't do anything. On the side of the China case in Shenzhen, you would have thought that, well, the state, of course, intervened. But no. Remember, it was the early days of reform. It was special economic zone. There was no labor law. Labor law came 1995. And in the past, the Chinese government regulated labor in China through the Mao era, whatnot, through policies, but not law. So, in a very strange way, the Shenzhen case also, to me, was a case of non-intervention, despite the fact that it is nominally a socialist state that you would think would known for the big hand of the state, visible hands of the state. But because it's a special economic zone, because it was the early day of economic reform, when the legal system was very underdeveloped, I didn't see any intervention. Now, this is the treatment of variable analysis, which is, I basically break down, okay, there are 5 variables. I compare this variable in this case with that case. Oh, they are the same. I say I hold it constant, or it is the same, and so therefore would not have been responsible for the outcome that I observed on the shop floor. And that's how I come to conclusion, or not the conclusion, one of the arguments is that the state doesn't matter, whereas the original theory give a big role to the state. Now, and then I look at another variable, because that variable isn't explanatory. That's basically what I do. And so I look at next variable, technology, the same. Union, the same. Class balance of power, there's no collective representation in either case. What is left? Right? The social organization of labor market. The labor market, there's certain organization in the labor market, things that made the supply of female workers possible. And the gender organization of labor market, that's how I frame it, seems to be different across the two cases. And I think from my observation, I saw that managers actually care about the supply of workers. They actually think about where these women come from and therefore how they should either concede to them or control them. In the case of Hong Kong, they try to make work hours flexible because they know these women need to take care of their families in order to be able to come to work, and they need that pool of workers. And therefore, the social organization of the labor market is not something objectively existing out there that differ, but is what the managers themselves are actively thinking. And by doing ethnography, I know this is something that they take into account when they decide how to manage the shop floor. Had I not done the ethnography, I may not be able to pinpoint out of many other possible reasons. This is the factor that affected management behavior. And also in the Shenzhen case, the same thing, that the same group of workers, why are they so nice or kinder, gentler to the women workers in Hong Kong, but not to the women workers in Shenzhen? Because the supply of these workers come with a certain construction of these single women, and they came through the networks of natives, local villagers. They came to Shenzhen. They didn't find a job themselves. A lot of them depended on the localistic groups that they came together. So the organization of the labor market is different, and the kind of notion about these women workers, who they are, who should they be, how should they behave, came embedded in that supply in the labor market. They came, okay, only when they are young. Once they get married, they should go back. These are maiden workers. They come working hard. They should be under the supervision of their villagers, because that's how they secure the reputation as good girls, because they're still waiting to be married. They have to be controlled. They have to be supervised. That's the reason why their parents would let them come. So these things vary. These two variables, this variable in these two cases varies, and the managers actually consider the variation to devise the different ways of managing the shop floor. Now, so what I did in this particular study was I took these variables and compare and contrast and identify which one actually caused the variation. This is what we call variable analysis. That is, in the two cases, you have two cases or three cases or whatever number, you break it down into analytical variables, analyzable variables that are connected to theory. There are other variables like size, which I didn't consider because size is not theoretically relevant, although empirically these are factories of different sizes. So basically the treatment, this kind of comparison is what we call variable comparison, and you'll find a lot of them. I must say almost the majority of comparison in the comparative historical sociology field, in statistical field, in quantitative analyses. This is the mode of analysis, comparative analysis, that is most prevalent in sociology. Now, why am I saying that? Why did I say that? If I were to redo this, I wouldn't do it, and I didn't like the study now. The problem, and this is this auto-critique part, I at least find two problems with this approach to variable analysis. The first one is, you think about the causal the causal relations, the notion of causality in variable analysis. The causality is what we call the additive model, adding one variable to the equation, more variable, maybe two variables explain more variance. This is the statistical model. One variable explains 30% of the variance, you add another, becomes 50. And these variables are added together and you examine the individual effect independent of each other. And then cases internally, each case is consisted of a number of variables. This is the additive model of causation. This variable explains this variable explains that much, and you add them together. Another alternative causation model, which makes more sense actually, is to treat these so-called variables not as independent addable parts to the whole set of variables, but to treat them together as a constellation, as a whole case. You don't break them down because what each variable does varies with what other variables they are together with. So it's the whole constellation that should be the unit of analysis and not the individual variables. How would that be different if I apply this chemical, what we call chemical mode of causation? Chemical means that if you have one chemical, I don't know, I used to know the name, like sodium and chloride, is that something, some chemical elements? Sodium is one thing, right? Chloride is another, is it? And when you mix them, what will happen? It becomes something else. If you mix sodium with not chloride, but something else, the result will be different. There is no linear consequence of any of these chemical element. Depends what it is, depends on what its essence, its quality, depends on what you mix it up with. So for instance, ethnicity. Is ethnicity going to divide class solidarity, or is ethnicity going to enhance class solidarity in a strike, let's say, for people who study protest? Is it creating solidarity, or is it splitting solidarity, ethnicity?
Depends.
It depends, exactly. Which means ethnicity as a variable, its effect, its impact, depends on what you mix it with. In different situations, it will give rise to it will cause different things. So you can't treat ethnicity as if it is a variable that is linear, that is, you add more, you have more, and it has a constant property. Okay, so how does that apply to my case then? In my case, think about how I treated the state. I said, well, because both are non-intervention, I deleted the state from my analysis, from my argument, basically saying the state has no influence. Because in my two cases, both are non-intervention and it doesn't explain my outcome. What is the alternative? The alternative is to look at each case in and of itself as a constellation, interrelated features, variables, and understand the logic among and what relations or what outcomes they together produce, and not to break them, disaggregate them, and compare across the case to the other similar variables. So what would have happened if I were to do it again? And using the chemical mode of causation, not breaking down my two cases into variables, I would have developed, for instance, in Hong Kong, I would look at the state, how it affects labor market, how it affects other factors in the case, other variables. So for instance, I would say, instead of saying, oh, the state doesn't explain, I would develop a theory of labor regime for colonial state. and say because colonial government doesn't have any social insurance because it doesn't care, it's colonial regime, it doesn't give much legal power to workers, so there's no pressure to develop welfare state, so labor has no protection. I would say that because there's lack of welfare policy developed by this colonial government, therefore women had to go out to work. The family has no public assistance, is all dependent on the market. They have to come out to work despite the fact that they have family responsibilities. And how, so the state has a role to play in pushing women into the labor market. And when they were pushing the labor market and still have to combine family with wage work, and therefore these employers, these managers have to take into account how to accommodate them and make this more flexible at that moment in Hong Kong's industrial development. In the case of China, in Shenzhen, I would not say the state plays no role. I would say that it's state socialist or state socialist government in the process of reform, what they have done to create the supply of women workers. Well, they reformed the hukou system to let these women come, but did not provide the institution to channel them as individuals. They just let the village, social organization, the village, to become the channel because the state doesn't want to spend. It is experiment. They didn't want to, there is no institution. They didn't use any state bureaucratic institution to steer labor. They were experimenting. And that's why the only thing they did was to loosen up the hukou system to let people flow. And people, of course, rely on the social organization, the more natural village organization. And so they come to Shenzhen. And so come with all these kind of village culture and the familial, the patriarchal kind of organization of the village. So in the treatment of these two cases will be different. I would have developed two theories linking the respective nature of the state. Instead of saying the state has no role, I would have theorized how the state affects the labor market and maybe workers' power or lack of power, and manager react to it. I mean, in the end, I'm still explaining the difference in the shop floor culture, but instead of canceling the state out because they seem not to have done anything, comparing state to state, I should link the features within the case as a case and theorize that way, and not to say the state has no role. Does it make sense to you how these two approaches, how two ways to proceed would lead to very different ideas? And what underlies the variable comparison was this additive notion of causation rather than a chemical notion of causation. And had I looked at the variables, relate them together and see how they interact with each other instead of breaking them up into variables. That's the key move that I did wrong, looking back. Another very important critique about variable comparison, in this particular case, I totally missed that these two cases are connected. They were connected, they couldn't be treated as different, not just because they were owned by the same company and same group and run by the same group of managers, which I have explained, but then from then on, I treated them as independent of each other. Now, what connected them was at the more macro political economic level. They are connected in the sense that the Shenzhen plant, why did they run two plants? Because they were not sure if the communist regime would continue the reform. They were not sure about whether investing there was safe. They want to try it out, and therefore they kept the Hong Kong plant. In case things go bad, they can relocate back to Hong Kong. But they were taking advantage of the scale, the cheapness of labor and land and everything. So the large majority of production went in Shenzhen. The Hong Kong plant was smaller, although the same. Now, had I been more aware of their connection, the story would be that these two plants are connected and because in the mind of the managers and the company, the profit structure, which of these two plans are more important for them to create profit? Of course, the Shenzhen plan. And that's why there's a more despotic, more exploitative, more control-oriented shop floor, because that's where the revenue, the profit center come from. Whereas the Hong Kong plant is important, but as a kind of support, as a kind of testing out the line before it moves to Shenzhen for large-scale production, for mass production, testing out and with skilled workers testing out. It's not the profit center of the company. And therefore, they can allow these women workers to be freer, to be more flexible, because in the whole schema of the company, they play different roles. And these are connected, and connected by the larger political economy of China that was evolving at that point with all the uncertainty that capital has to deal with, and with different weight in terms of, how important it is. These two companies are to the firm's bottom line. So, and these are connected, but I treated them as separate, as independent, equal parts, equal cases to compare. So I think these two are really fatal. I wouldn't have passed my student's thesis if it was written by a student of mine. No, I'm kidding. But that's the thing that you come away through time, you learn, and also it's not like the additive model is invalid. As I said, that has been and still is the majority mode of comparison because of the influence of quantitative sociology, I think. But when you think about it, there at least, I should say that at least, if not wrong, but there is at least an alternative. And it's up to you to see which one you think is more productive, more reflexive of reality, and more explanatory of factory regime using women workers. But I think this exercise, reading this, you see, how variable comparison works. And then when we move on to the next class on the labor protests in Sun Belt and Rust Belt, I think at that point, maybe the topic itself, because I was looking at regional political economy, a subnational comparison, I was more aware of how these two regions actually belong to the same country, which is hard to miss, and there was more of a sense that the fact that these two groups have to fight their own way, have to protest in different ways, actually explain why there was no national labor movement, because they basically have to raise their own trail, and these people totally don't see each other as sharing common interest. And together, you can see why there was no national protest, no national labor movement, but many, many, many protests. And that's why the regime is still very stable, despite the rising number of protests. I don't know whether you are familiar with that, but if you look at protest number, it's always rising, but never any sense of almost no indication that the regime is endangered or under threats. And this is the reason, because looking beneath the numbers, you realize the two major segments of the working class, they don't see eye to eye, they are just developing their own modes of resistance. And so you bring them together, you can explain the national situation.